The camera mounted in the belly of his F6F Hellcat clicked away with a steady, mechanical rhythm. It was a sound that should have been reassuring, a sign of a mission going exactly to plan. Below him, the island of Peleliu scrolled past, a smear of green jungle and white coral at 8,000 feet. The date was September 12, 1944. For Major Robert Cowboy Stout, this was supposed to be a milk run. His orders were as simple as they come: fly over the northern airfield, let the automatic camera do its work, and fly back to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Intelligence was confident the field was a ghost town, probably cratered and useless from previous bombing raids. It was a box-checking exercise, a final look-see before the main event. Then, Stout glanced down past his wing, and the routine flight turned into a moment that would echo in military history. His blood ran cold. The airfield wasn't abandoned, it wasn't damaged, it was a hornet's nest. Below him, parked in perfect, deadly rows, was an entire Japanese air group. He could make them out clearly: the iconic Mitsubishi Zeros, agile and lethal; the heavier twin-engine Nakajima bombers. Dozens and dozens of them, lined up wingtip to wingtip, gleaming in the tropical sun. He saw stacks of fuel drums arranged in neat pyramids. He saw ground crews swarming over the aircraft like ants, topping off tanks, loading ammunition belts. This wasn't an abandoned field, this was a staging area for a massive, imminent attack. Stout's mind raced, his pilot's eye taking a grim inventory. He did a quick count: at least 40 aircraft. All of them looked fully armed, fully fueled, and ready for takeoff. And in that terrifying instant, he knew exactly what they were waiting for. In just 3 days, on September 15th, an immense American invasion fleet would appear over the horizon. 28,000 U.S. Marines were set to storm the beaches of this very island in one of the most ambitious amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. That fleet was already at sea, steaming towards this exact location, a floating city of men and material, completely unaware of the welcome party being prepared for them. These 40 Japanese planes were a dagger, poised to strike the heart of the invasion before a single Marine set foot on the sand. Stout's training, drilled into him over countless hours, was crystal clear. The protocol for a reconnaissance pilot was rigid. You spot the enemy, you radio the coordinates, you get the hell out of there, and you return to base. You are the eyes of the fleet, not the fist. Your job is to observe and report, not to engage. Especially not alone. Especially not against an entire airfield bristling with anti-aircraft guns that hadn't even noticed you yet. But Stout also knew the grinding, agonizingly slow reality of military bureaucracy. By the time he flew back to the Hornet, landed, was debriefed, filed his report, and that report made its way up the chain of command, by the time they assembled a proper strike package of bombers and fighters, hours would pass, maybe even a full day. In that time, the Japanese could scatter these planes, hiding them in hardened shelters or camouflaging them in the jungle. Or worse, much worse, they could simply launch them. They could launch them against the approaching fleet, catching the transports and landing craft in open water. The Marines who would be packed into those Higgins boats in 3 days didn't have the luxury of time. They couldn't wait for proper procedure. They needed these planes gone. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours. They needed them destroyed now. Stout banked his Hellcat, climbing higher, a predator circling its prey. He studied the layout below, his mind no longer that of a photographer, but a tactician. And he saw it. In their haste to prepare, the Japanese had made a fatal error. The aircraft were jammed together, a dense, vulnerable forest of aluminum and high-octane fuel. And surrounding them, completely exposed, were those stacks of fuel drums. It was a powder keg waiting for a match. One good burst of machine gun fire in the right place could set off a chain reaction, a torrent of fire that could consume the entire field. He glanced at his instruments. His ammunition counters showed a full load. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. 2,400 rounds total. It sounds like a lot, but in the violent arithmetic of aerial combat, it translated to roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire. Just 12 seconds. Not nearly enough to hunt down and destroy 40 individual aircraft one by one. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough to light the fuse on that very, very big bomb. Before we dive into the cockpit with him, I want to ask you a question. What do you think you would have done in this situation? Follow your orders or follow your gut? Let me know down in the comments, and tell me if you've ever heard the incredible story of Cowboy Stout's one-man war. Now, Robert Stout was no reckless hotshot. At 28 years old, he was a seasoned veteran. He had 63 combat missions under his belt. He'd tangled with Zeros in swirling dogfights and come out on top. He'd strafed fortified island positions while tracers clawed at his cockpit. He'd landed his Hellcat on the pitching, rolling deck of a carrier in storms that sent other pilots back to their bunks. He knew the razor-thin line that separated courage from suicide, and the idea forming in his mind right now was tap dancing right on that line. If he attacked, every single anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would wake up and point directly at him. He was utterly alone. No wingman to suppress the ground fire, no one to watch his six, no one to cover his escape. His Grumman F6F Hellcat was a famously tough aircraft, nicknamed the Ironworks, but it wasn't invincible. One lucky 20mm shell to his engine, his oil cooler, or his cockpit, and it would be over. He'd become another forgotten wreck swallowed by the jungle, with zero chance of rescue. But if he didn't attack, he saw the alternative with horrifying clarity. He pictured those 40 planes launching in waves, Japanese pilots, grim and determined, diving on the American fleet. He saw them strafing the landing craft, turning the water red. He saw them bombing the transport ships, packed shoulder to shoulder with Marines. He saw the beaches turning into chaos, into a killing zone, before the first wave could even establish a foothold. Stout had seen it happen before. He'd flown close air support during the bloody Battle of Tarawa, where Japanese planes had inflicted horrific casualties on the first waves of Marines. He had watched from his cockpit, powerless, as enemy bombers targeted the crowded, slow-moving landing craft that had no way to fight back and nowhere to run. The memory was seared into his mind. The choice, the monumental decision that would define his life and the lives of 1,000 others, took him less than 30 seconds. Stout pushed the throttle lever all the way to the firewall. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared to life, its 2,000 horsepower pulling him forward. He rolled the Hellcat over and plunged into a steep, gut-wrenching dive. The altimeter needle began to unwind like a frantic clock. 7,000 feet. 5,000, 3,000. The jungle canopy rushed up to meet him. His plan was brutally simple, forged in that 30-second decision. Come in low and unbelievably fast. Hit the fuel drums first. Use their own weapon against them. And get out before the gunners on the ground could even register what was happening. At 2,000 feet, he pulled out of the steep dive and leveled off, pushing the nose down until he was a ghost skimming the treetops. The Hellcat surged, accelerating to nearly 400 miles per hour, the engine screaming at its absolute limit. The jungle below became a green, whipping blur. He was barely 50 feet off the ground, a blue and white missile of vengeance. The airfield erupted into view through a gap in the trees. For a split second, there was only confusion on the ground. Japanese mechanics looked up from their work, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Some froze in place. Others began to run, diving for cover. None of them made it to their anti-aircraft guns in time. Stout centered his gun sight on the northernmost row of parked aircraft. He squeezed the trigger on his control stick. The world exploded in sound. All 6 of his Browning machine guns opened up at once, a deafening metallic roar that completely drowned out the sound of his engine. A stream of 50 caliber tracers, like fiery fingers, reached out across the tarmac. He watched them stitch a line of brilliant holes across the thin aluminum skin of a Zero fighter. The plane shuddered as if punched by an invisible giant. Fuel, atomized and volatile, sprayed from its ruptured wing tanks. Stout made a tiny adjustment with his rudder pedals, walking his fire to the side, directly into a cluster of fuel drums stacked neatly between 2 Nakajima bombers. The drums didn't just rupture, they vaporized. 50 caliber rounds tore through the thin steel, and the aviation fuel inside detonated in a single colossal fireball. The explosion was far bigger, far more violent than Stout could have ever anticipated. A column of roiling orange flame leaped hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave, a physical hammer of pressure, slammed into his Hellcat, rocking it violently as he yanked back on the stick, climbing hard to escape the blast. He glanced over his shoulder. Behind him, the fire was spreading with a terrifying, hungry speed. The first burning zero acted like a torch, igniting the plane parked right next to it. That fire leaped to the next, and then the next, each new explosion feeding the inferno. A chain reaction of doom. Within seconds, half of the entire northern row of aircraft was engulfed in a swirling vortex of flame and black smoke. On the ground, chaos reigned. Japanese ground crews ran in every direction, abandoning any thought of saving the planes. Finally, the anti-aircraft gunners reached their positions. The sky around Stout began to fill with puffs of black smoke as their guns opened up. He was already climbing, weaving his plane back and forth to throw off their aim. He saw the lazy red arcs of tracer rounds drifting past his canopy. He felt it more than heard it, a series of heavy, shuddering thuds that vibrated through the entire airframe. 20mm rounds were punching holes through his tail section. Warning lights began to flicker on his instrument panel. But the engine, his beautiful, tough-as-nails engine, kept running strong. He banked hard to the right, gaining altitude and circling back for a look. What he saw below was biblical. A scene of total devastation. Nearly 20 aircraft were now blazing pyres, the flames spreading across the tarmac like a river of lava. A thick, greasy column of black smoke was boiling thousands of feet into the sky, a funeral pyre visible for 100 miles. But the job wasn't done. On the southern end of the field, at least 20 more aircraft sat untouched, their crews now scrambling to get them started and dispersed. Stout checked his ammo counter, half gone. He had maybe 6 seconds of firing time left. And now the gunners were ready. They were alert, angry, and tracking his every move as he circled overhead. To go back in for a second pass was not just asking to be shot down, it was suicide. He rolled his Hellcat inverted and dove anyway. This time, the reception was immediate and overwhelming. The air around him filled with tracers, a storm of angry red hornets converging on his position. He jinked left, then right, then left again, never flying in a straight line for more than a second, forcing the gunners to constantly readjust. The Hellcat shuddered again under more impacts. He heard the sickening sound of tearing metal somewhere behind him in the fuselage. He came in from a completely different angle, streaking low over the southern end of the field. He lined up on the big, fat bombers and squeezed the trigger. His remaining ammunition hammered into the planes, shredding tails, ripping through wings, and puncturing fuel tanks. He walked his fire across a fuel truck parked beside a bomber. The truck exploded with such force that it flipped the nearby multi-ton bomber completely onto its back like a child's toy. The secondary explosions began instantly. Burning fuel from the truck sprayed across a stack of ammunition crates. They cooked off, detonating in a rapid, popcorn-like series of blasts. The bombs already loaded onto the Japanese planes began to cook off as well, tearing the aircraft apart from the inside out. Within moments, the southern row was burning just as fiercely as the northern one. Stout's guns fell silent. They were empty. He'd fired every last round. He pulled up, and the Hellcat felt heavy, sluggish. Damaged control surfaces were fighting him, making the stick feel like it was set in concrete. More warning lights flashed on his console. Something was leaking, leaving a thin trail of smoke behind him. But below, the entire airfield was an inferno. Every single aircraft, every fuel drum, every building was being consumed by the fire. The smoke column now towered over the island, a grim monument marking the spot. Stout pointed the battered nose of his Hellcat toward the open ocean and began the long, nerve-wracking flight back to the USS Hornet. The hydraulics were failing, making the controls dangerously unresponsive. The oil pressure gauge was dropping steadily. He had no idea if his landing gear would even extend. But the engine was still turning. That was all that mattered. The flight back felt like an eternity. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold, heavy realization of what he had just done. He had flagrantly, unequivocally disobeyed a direct order. Instead of a simple photo run, he had single-handedly attacked and destroyed an entire enemy airbase. A court-martial was a very real possibility. So was getting screamed at by every officer from his squadron commander all the way up to the admiral. But the alternative? The image of those 40 planes falling upon the helpless Marines. That would have been a punishment far worse than anything the Navy could ever devise. The familiar silhouette of the Hornet appeared on the horizon. Stout keyed his microphone, his voice steady. He reported his situation. Aircraft heavily damaged, uncertain about the landing gear, requesting an emergency priority landing. On the carrier, the deck was cleared. The ship turned into the wind, preparing to receive its wounded bird. He cycled the landing gear handle. 2 green lights, 1 red. One of the main wheels was stuck, only partially extended. He was going to have to land it as is. He came in hot, fighting the damaged controls. His one good wheel and the tailhook hit the deck. He caught the second arrestor wire. The damaged Hellcat slammed onto the steel flight deck with a sickening crunch of buckling metal. Before the propellers had even stopped spinning, deck crews swarmed the aircraft, their faces etched with shock. The plane was a wreck. The tail section was shredded, looking like Swiss cheese. The fuselage was riddled with over a dozen gaping holes. The paint on the wings was scorched black from where he'd flown through his own explosions. Stout unstrapped himself and climbed down from the cockpit, physically and emotionally exhausted. He found himself facing a wall of grim-faced officers. The air boss, the man in charge of the flight deck, wanted to know why his reconnaissance plane had come back looking like it had gone 10 rounds with the entire Japanese Navy. His squadron commander demanded to know why he had broken radio silence and engaged the enemy. The intelligence officer just wanted to know what in the hell had happened over Peleliu. Stout's report was blunt and to the point. The airfield wasn't abandoned. It was a forward attack base, packed with aircraft preparing to slaughter the invasion fleet. So he destroyed them. All of them. 40 aircraft, gone. The whole thing, from his first dive to his last bullet, took 8 minutes. The officers just stared at him. The intelligence officer asked him to repeat the number. 40? 40 enemy aircraft destroyed by one pilot in one plane? It sounded impossible. It sounded like a wild exaggeration, a pilot's tall tale. Until the photos came back. The next day, reconnaissance planes flew over the same northern airfield. Their photos confirmed Stout's story in the most dramatic way possible. The airfield was annihilated. Not a single operational aircraft remained. The photos showed the burned-out skeletal hulks of exactly 40 Japanese planes, scattered across a blackened, scorched tarmac. The fuel dumps were nothing but craters. The buildings were rubble. Intelligence officers hastily revised their estimates. Instead of facing a swarm of 40 enemy planes on D-Day, the Marines would hit the beaches with complete and total air superiority. The single greatest threat to the invasion had been eliminated before the invasion had even begun, all by one pilot who had the courage to break the rules. The Navy did not court-martial Robert Stout. They awarded him the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for combat valor. His citation praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in single-handedly attacking a vastly superior enemy force. His decision, the Navy concluded, had directly and undoubtedly saved American lives. But the battle for Peleliu that followed was still a nightmare. The Marines landed on September 15th and were immediately met with some of the most ferocious and costly fighting of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had turned the island's labyrinthine network of coral ridges and caves into a fortress. The battle raged for over 2 months and cost the lives of nearly 2,000 Americans. And yet, as horrific as those numbers were, they would have been far, far worse without Stout's 8 minutes of decisive action. Military historians would later analyze the engagement, calculating that Stout's solo attack likely saved between 500 and 1,000 Marine lives on the first day of the invasion alone. His 8 minutes of unauthorized combat had accomplished what an entire squadron of bombers might have struggled to achieve. And he did it at the one single moment when it mattered most, before the Japanese had a chance to react. After the war, Cowboy Stout returned to California and lived a quiet life. He rarely, if ever, spoke of what he did over Peleliu. His own children grew up simply knowing their dad had been a pilot in the war. They wouldn't learn the full details until they were adults. The Navy Cross, his medal for extraordinary heroism, sat in a desk drawer, not displayed on a wall. He was a man deeply uncomfortable with praise. When asked about the attack in his later years, he would just shrug it off. "I saw planes that needed destroying," he'd say, "so I destroyed them. Any pilot would have done the same." But he was wrong about that. Not every pilot would have. Most would have followed orders. Most would have dutifully flown back to the carrier, reported their findings, and let the gears of command turn at their own pace. That by-the-book approach would have been disastrous. It was Stout's willingness to disobey, to trust his own eyes and his own judgment, that made all the difference. His story remained a footnote, largely unknown outside of military aviation circles until historians rediscovered the mission reports decades later. When they cross-referenced his Navy Cross citation with captured Japanese records and the stunning aerial photos, they realized the true scale of his achievement. One man, one aircraft, 8 minutes, 40 enemy planes destroyed, and potentially 1,000 friendly lives saved. What Stout did that day demonstrated a principle that military strategists now study intently: the immense value of initiative at the tactical level. Stout couldn't have known for certain his decision was the right one. He was making an educated guess about the enemy's intentions, gambling that his assessment of the threat was correct, and betting his own life on his ability to pull it off. Everything about the situation screamed for caution. Follow orders, report back, let the admirals make the decision. But Stout understood a fundamental truth of warfare. Sometimes the person on the scene, with their own eyes on the target, has a better grasp of the situation than a commander looking at a map 50 miles away. He understood the intent behind his mission, which was to protect the invasion force. And when his literal orders conflicted with that intent, he chose to serve the mission, not the words on the paper. The Navy, by awarding him the Navy Cross instead of a court-martial, acknowledged this. They knew that rigid, blind adherence to orders in this case would have led to a catastrophe. Stout's disobedience was, in fact, the highest form of duty. Today, fighter pilots study Stout's attack, not just for his flying skill, but for his decision-making under unimaginable pressure. He didn't waste his precious 12 seconds of ammunition trying to kill 40 planes one by one. He identified the critical vulnerability, the fuel drums, and exploited it brilliantly. One bullet in the right place can do the work of 1,000 in the wrong ones. And when his ammunition was spent, he didn't linger. He left. The mission was done. Robert Cowboy Stout passed away in 2005 at the age of 89. In the end, his 8-minute attack over Peleliu stands as one of the most successful and impactful solo combat missions in the history of naval aviation. The Marines who fought and bled on that terrible island never knew that a lone Navy pilot had broken every rule in the book to save their lives. They just knew that on the day they hit the beaches, the skies were clear. Sometimes, the most heroic thing a person can do is refuse to follow orders. Not out of rebellion, but out of a deeper understanding of the mission. When confronted with a choice between doing what he was told and doing what needed to be done, Cowboy Stout made his choice, and 1,000 men went home to their families because of it.